This year has been a very special year for me and for all of us who are really into Colorado history because this represents the 200th anniversary of the Stephen Long expedition. This behind are the Pawnee Buttes. They didn't make it quite that far north, but I'd like to more or less say that uh, researching this expedition and learning about it has been one of the highlights of my past year, and it's been fun to share this because it has some special relevance to the Plant Select program, as you're about to see. So, hmm. But before we go to the European, the first Europeans to explore this area, or the first scientists really, uh, the there is a long tradition that we always should be honoring of the people who have been here for a very long time, the native peoples. And in Colorado, we have the Mesa Verde, which is probably the most spectacular remnants we have of the native people's culture prior to European sort of colonization, inundation of the West. But I also think that we forget that the native peoples have been living with the plants, and we're utilizing the plants and leaving a record that went back a very long time. And I always like to give a tribute to them because the interaction that the native peoples had, certainly with the early explorers, is in Colorado was something which is, I think, very positive. Because the first scientific expedition that did come here, the Stephen Long expedition, uh, really came here to study the people as much as the plants, and they left a fantastic record of the native peoples, and they by and large had extremely good relationships with them and were very interested in them, as you'll see. um, but our native landscape can be very lush, like it was on a particularly nice spring when this picture was taken. It happened the year that they came. 1820 was a drought year, and so things were pretty dry, and they were pretty horrified. And the trip, the expedition of this first scientific expedition, uh, found the Great Plains to be mostly brown and very little in the way of bloom. Uh, and so their impression was that it was a desert. And the Long expedition is probably best known for having called this area the Great American Desert, as you'll see. Uh, but it's not a desert. It's a very lush and wonderful semi-arid steppe. These are pictures I took a few years ago when I visited the Soapstone Prairie just outside of Fort Collins in August. Of course, that was a year there was some rain. This year is more like the year that they visited 200 years ago, because the entire state of Colorado today, they announced the entire state is in drought status. So the problem with the Stephen Long expedition is that there was another expedition that occurred about almost 15, 20 years before theirs, and that was the Lewis and Clark expedition. And because they were like the Hertz, they were the first. And everybody kind of pays honor to them, and they had Sacagawea. It was very romantic. And the Lewis and Clark expedition, of course, has been tremendously studied, and there have been just a tremendous number of books written about it. But this other expedition, that was from 1804 to 1806, the other expedition, the first scientific expedition to our area, started in Pittsburgh, as you'll see. And this is roughly the route they took. They went down to the Mississippi River, then up the Missouri, and went up along the Platte River, and then eventually, right now, 200 years ago, right now they were somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, I believe. So they were on their way back. And that's the Stephen Long expedition from 1819 to 1820. And there was an expedition in between. It did cover some of the same territory, but it was not really a scientific expedition. They didn't have scientists like the Stephen Long expedition, and they did get into trouble. As you can see, they ended up in Mexico because he was arrested for going into Mexican, into Spanish actually, area. And so the Zebulon Pike expedition, even though he did leave a lot of records and notes, does not have the same value to posterity for information about the region. And ironically, the mountain that we now call Pikes Peak he claimed could never be climbed by anyone because it was so high. He was here at a time of year where it was all covered with snow, and he thought it was just the highest mountain on earth, and nobody could possibly ever climb it. But the very next year, of 15 years, 10 years later, I guess, the Stephen Long expedition came by, and Edwin James and a couple of his colleagues practically scampered to the top. It took them 2 days from down on the Great Plains to make it to the top and back. And they were, it was quite a sprint, but they did actually climb the peak. And Stephen Long declared that the mountain should be named James Peak in his honor. And it was for about 20 years, but eventually, because Pike was had had such a romantic episode in Mexico, perhaps, or his publicity, who knows why. Eventually, it was changed to Pikes Peak. And so the mountain we now call Pikes Peak did have a prior name. The stories that I'll tell in the course of this are mostly, a lot of them were extracted from this book, which was published in about 1823, and it's called The Account of an Expedition from Pittsburgh to the Rocky Mountains, performed in the years 1819, 1820. It's an absolutely wonderful book. It's been continuously in print in the United States and also in England for essentially almost 200 years. It's been published in many, many editions, and it's available on the net. You can actually get it for free. And it's a book that's very interesting to read. And the painting that you can see on the right-hand side is of Major Long, and he was an incredible leader, and it was painted by Peel, who was actually one of the participants. He was one of the painters, and he was a scientist who was primarily studying the birds and the mammals. On the left-hand side is the only portrait we have of Edwin James, who actually wrote the book. Part of the reason he wrote the book was the notes that Peel took, and that Say, the two other scientists, took copious notes, but their notes were lost when several people who were part of the expedition took some of the horses and snuck away towards the end of the trip, and took the material with them, which was lost forever, which is really a great tragedy. So Edwin James did sit down and compiled the whole thing pretty much from his notes and from consulting with the others, of course. And this is one of the maps in it, which is surprisingly accurate considering this area hasn't been dealt with before. You can actually see the shape of Arkansas in there, and Kansas, and Illinois is pretty well formed, Missouri. This was published in 1823, mind you, when most of these areas, Kentucky, Tennessee, they were pretty missing in people. And if you look carefully, you will see that it says on this map that was published in the 1823 edition, this area was called the Great American Desert. And you can see that the Great American Desert is in Spanish territory. They didn't go quite into Spanish territory. They mostly stuck into what is Arkansas. So this was considered Arkansas back then. And here's a close-up showing the Great American Desert. That was the term they used because nobody had bothered to go to, had gotten it to the Mojave or the Chihuahuan or the Sonoran, the real deserts. So it was a mistake that was eventually recognized. But these are all some of the notes were in here. And there you can see Castle Rock is indicated, but it's not our Castle Rock. It was probably a different mountain that looked similar to it nearby. And James Peak is also indicated on the map, which of course is now called Pikes Peak. And these are some of the most famous plants that were found there. We'll take a closer look at them in a minute, but the Colorado columbine was found on that expedition, and it was not spelled with an A-E like that. It was spelled O-E, so that should be corrected. And the tree is the limber pine, which was named from that expedition, and also the Jamesia. And we'll take a closer look at Jamesia in a minute, and that was named for Edwin James. And this is actually the actual specimen that James collected on, probably on Pikes Peak, and it was only named in 1840 by by John Torrey and Gray. So it was named almost 20 years after he collected it, because they collected about 500 specimens, and it was amazing that these plants sat around in John Torrey's herbarium. But you can imagine he was getting plants from all over the United States. This was a huge lot of really weird stuff. So he just kind of stockpiled it, and he'd go occasionally and he'd name a few in this production or that production. This wasn't actually published till they did the very first Flora of North America between John Torrey and Asa Gray. So that's the actual specimen plucked by Edwin James and carried across the Great Plains, on the back of pack animals, and eventually it made its way to New York. This is a close-up of our plant, and it's well known to people in the Denver area because it's so abundant in the foothills around Denver, where it's rocky and whatnot. And Plant Select has actually chosen to make this one of our selections, and it's a pretty spectacular plant. It does need somewhat of a shady spot, and it doesn't want to be, it would like a soil that's well drained. So it's not something you just plunk at any old place, but planted right in the Denver area can do very well. And it has not only waxy, fragrant flowers, but it has incredible fall color. Just to show you how the world has progressed, the very first specimen was only taken by a scientist in 1820, but since then, other forms have been formed. Here's a pink flowered form, which I've never seen, but it's found mostly on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. There's the range of it is indicated there. It's one we should explore because we might have another terrific plant for us to grow. And just recently they have segregated a third species, Jamesia tetrapetala. There's one that has 4 petals that grows pretty much just around Salt Lake City and a few other places in Utah. So the whole range of the species of the genus is indicated on the map there. You can see it's found mostly in Colorado, New Mexico, a little bit down in Arizona. Then there's these populations in California and in Utah that are quite distinct with the pink flowers and the 4 petals. So science has come a long way in the 200 years since they found it, but you can imagine how exciting it was as they traveled across the country to find all sorts of wonderful plants. They found they collected a specimen of Dahlia candida, which was identified at first as Dahlia. I guess it was albiflora, oligophila, something else. It's gone through various names. It was actually collected slightly before them in another locality. So this wasn't named from that expedition, but they did collect it, one of the first specimens collected. This was the first collection of showy milkweed, was made on that expedition, and it was made in Nebraska. And this plant is also extremely widespread around the entire United States and Canada as well. And it's amazing that nobody had found it before this particular expedition. Another plant that was named by this expedition was our mountain maple. You can see from the map that it's found just about everywhere in the West, but not that many people had been doing collections back then. So sure enough, the first specimen, and you can see on the left-hand side, that's actually a photograph of that specimen taken 200 years ago this past June by Edwin James. So I think that's a pretty cool thing. This, my friends, is what Denver looked like according to the artist on the expedition. I believe this was painted by Seymour. He was one of the artists who was sent along. And you can see there was a little line of buffalo that kind of made a nice little line on one side, and then on the other side there's a line of Indians, presumably Arapaho, and they're also an Indian file. It's kind of funny to the artist was somewhat imaginative, and you can see there's not a lot of houses out there or even teepees. There's I think 1 tree and a few smaller trees, and that's probably Long's Peak in the distance. So you can see that the landscape, at least perceived by them, was pretty different from what we have here nowadays. A plant that was also collected by that expedition was the sulfur flower. Eriogonum umbellatum, and this was, you can see that Eriogonum umbellatum grows practically in every county in the West, but the very first time it was collected was by the James expedition, probably somewhere between Denver and Colorado Springs. And once again, this is a plant that Plant Select has put into the program. So it's amazing that so many of the Plant Select plants were first collected 200 years ago on this expedition. But the plant that's most famous probably from that expedition was Aquilegia cerulean. This is our Colorado columbine, and he waxes quite poetic when he describes it. And Edwin James only named one or two plants on that expedition, and this is one of them. He actually wanted to give the name to it because he knew it was a very special and a unique plant. This is the actual text of the book, and I think it's really worth reading a bit of it because Edwin James was a wonderful writer, and you can imagine his excitement as he's climbing Pikes Peak, or James Peak, we should call it, way back then. He says, a little above the point where the timber disappears entirely commences a region of astonishing beauty and of great interest on the account of its productions. And he just waxes poetic about the alpine area. You know, most of these plants are matted, but their flower is the most conspicuous, and the coloring is astonishingly brilliant. So he really did have a sense of wonder, and that is conveyed in his descriptions. He was, by the way, the first European botanist to climb above tree line in the West. He was the first person of European ancestry to collect scientifically in the Southern Rockies. So there were a lot of firsts on this expedition that it's good to be aware of. And one of the magnificent productions he found on Pikes Peak was a purple saxifrage, which was named in his honor by John Torrey. This is Telasonix jamesii. Torrey called it Saxifraga jamesii because it's in the saxifrage family, but eventually it was segregated into a different genus. But here it is growing in my home garden. It's one of my favorite plants for a trough. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is our Colorado Telasonix. There is another Telasonix. On the left-hand screen, you can see one that's not nearly as pretty that grows in Wyoming and in Montana and a few other places. That Telasonix grows on limestone. But they, at one time, they were thought to be the same species, but they've been segregated, and I'm glad they have been, because I think there's no question but that our Telasonix is much more striking. And of course, they collected the Alpine Campion. This is one of the flowers of great beauty. They collected quite a few of the Alpine flowers. I'm just showing a few of them. These are the actual specimens that they took and brought back. Of course, this was already named a lot earlier than that by Linnaeus. So this actually was not new to science, but it was new to the collections for the United States because it had not been found here before.
So Panayoti, where can you get some of those? Where can you get that Celine?
Well, that Silene, believe it or not, is being grown by quite a few specialty garden places. For example, LaPorte Alpine Nursery has grown and sold that here in Colorado in several forms. And there are mail order nurseries that offer these. Despite the fact that it's a high alpine plant, it grows surprisingly well, especially in a crevice garden or a rock garden or a trough. So it's actually a plant that's found around the world.
Thanks.
But the plant that I'm particularly keen on, because it's certainly one of the best xeriscape plants we'll ever grow, is Zinnia grandiflora. And it was first collected by this expedition. And interestingly enough, it was not named by John Torrey. It was named by Thomas Nuttall, who was another great botanist. He had access to the specimens, and he was very impressed with it, and he included it in a text that he wrote in 1840, which was about the new plants from the West that he had helped describe. Most of them were his own collections, but this was not. This was Edwin James' collection. We're going to forward to about 1872 or so, and here you can see a photograph that was taken of uh, most of the great botanists of North America uh, went on a trip across the Rockies with uh, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. There was a huge interest in the plants of this area, and you can see the botanist sitting there. The woman who's smack dab in the middle is we'll see her again in a few minutes. That's Alice Eastwood. She was a teacher here in Denver who went on to become a great botanist in California. But there's Asa Gray, is the gentleman with the long silvery beard who's sitting in the front. And then you can recognize Dalton Hooker's on the left-hand side. He has the beard, but no mustache. At any rate, this is a picture taken on Levada Pass, and they were camping and doing botanizing in the Rockies. Dalton Hooker actually went quite a few places in Colorado. This is his description of Georgetown. He says, here in this little town at the extreme finger end of civilization, the streets are watered better than in Kew. People sleep without locks on their doors, and the fire engines are well manned and in capital condition, and the food, there's no end, although it's too high to raise vegetables or any garden produce. This was a comment that he made when he was writing about this area. But of course, the people who were in Colorado at that period were mostly miners. So Colorado was not an area of which was much of a horticultural destination back then. People were coming because of the gold and later the silver. And also, this was the era of major factories in Europe and in the eastern United States. We forget the late 19th century was a period of tremendous tumult and change. And it was also an era where a lot of natural things were being destroyed and humans were starting to just take over the world. And there was a huge reaction to that. And the reaction was expressed by two people in particular, John Ruskin and William Morris. And they became part of the arts and crafts movement. And a lot of the arts and crafts movement was saying the world has become so ugly because of humanity has just been destroying nature. And there were so many people dedicated to studying plants and nature. And these were examples of the people who were starting to get an interest in really creating home landscapes and homes that were more beautiful. And the City Beautiful movement, which grew out of this, had a huge impact on Colorado. This is an example of what William Morris would be writing about. Have nothing in your house you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. No detail of interior design was overlooked by the pioneers of the arts and crafts movement. And this extended into horticulture with people like Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson. Suddenly, horticulture became an expression of beauty, of natural beauty, and a tremendous interest in that. And of course, the City Beautiful movement, which was inspired the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, had a huge impact on city design throughout the West. People realized we're destroying so much that is beautiful. Let us make our cities more beautiful. And it's interesting to see what kind of imagining this resulted in things like uh, the work of Frederick Law Olmsted and the many parks he designed all over the East, uh, notably in New York City with Central Park. This is the actual Columbia expedition. This is the kind of visionary glory that they described. And I don't see that in a whole lot of cities, but you can see a little bit of that grandeur in many of our cities downtown. But we cannot overestimate the impact that the arts and crafts movement had because you did have, especially in Washington, D.C., it helped transform our nation's capital into one of the most beautiful capital cities, designed very much along these principles of the arts and crafts movement. But this was brought to Denver by Robert Speer. And one of the reasons why Robert Speer is regarded as such a great mayor is that in addition to bringing some real, a tremendous number of different kinds of people into his administration, really serving for the first time ever, really serving the poor people in Denver as well as the wealthy class. He was very much a populist, but he was a man who was a visionary about gardens and parks. And he insisted that large areas be set aside for green spaces. And probably over half the parks in Denver that exist here today were actually mandated by Mayor Speer. So I think he really is truly one of the greatest mayors. And one of the people who came in his era was a German named Reinhard Schütze, and he was one of the first landscape architects, probably the first landscape architect, and he designed Fairmont Cemetery and several other sites. So this was the very beginning of city design. And Fairmont, of course, is one of the very first great monuments of the City Beautiful movement in Denver. And Crown Hill followed a little bit later, but it's also an extremely well designed. And both of these now have been declared arboreta and are very much full of very valuable tree collections and shrubs as well. And the plants that were being grown back then were many of the plants that we honor right now, the various oriental poppies and peonies and irises and roses and lilacs. Interestingly enough, many of these come from a very similar climate in Eurasia, the steppe climate, but they were brought up out, and people were starting to grow these in the Denver area even in the 19th century. And as you can see, these are their wild antecedents. The peonies come from the steppes of Asia, the poppies, irises, and roses. It's interesting, the early pioneers realized that what some of the best plants were and where they might have come from. The real father of American horticulture and the man who became the Olmsted of the Rockies really was a man named Sacco de Boer, and he was hired by Speer to design many of the parkways and many of the parks. And he was a tremendous visionary and a fantastic plant person, and he lived all the way up until the 1970s. So he came from Holland. He was very sick with tuberculosis. He was expected to not live very long, but Colorado back then became a place where a lot of people from Europe like that would come, and the climate did really heal their disease, and he lived to be a ripe old age. This is his actual house. He eventually built a beautiful house with a tower that recalled his home in the north of Netherlands. And I was very lucky to be able to visit that house once. This is the door. There's actually a picture of him, which I've never been able to find again, showing him at the door of his house. And the house itself is very imaginative and beautifully designed. It was recently sold. It's a private home, unfortunately. It would have been nice if it could have been a museum piece, because he is such an important figure in our history, but very imaginatively designed. When I was there, they still had his old file cabinets, and I don't know what ever became of them, but I think they're pretty wonderful thing to think that he was probably opened and closed those 100,000 times. So he really made Denver a city of parks. And this is something which I think we don't realize, just what a fantastic network of parks we have and how much we owe to the City Beautiful movement of the 19th century. And some of the people who worked with him, he was actually partners with a man named Walter Pesman, who wrote the Meet the Natives and some other fantastic books, and was another landscape architect who really, really valued the native plants and was looking towards inspiration from our native landscape. George Kelly, Rocky Mountain horticulture is different, and he was another one who really stressed the importance of looking at native plants and gardening in an appropriate fashion. And Dr. A.C. Hildreth was the first paid employee at Denver Botanic Gardens, and he in 1960 there was only one staff member here. Now we have about 300, and the history of Botanic Gardens has really been one of tremendous growth, and we probably owe a lot of it to our first director. And another person we owe, who designed several of our gardens, and of course is one of the greatest landscape architects of Colorado, Jane Silverstein Reis, who I remember visiting the Botanic Gardens regularly when I first started working here. She really was a force to be reckoned with, and she designed almost 1,000 gardens. Her firm did residential gardens around the Denver area. But two people I think we really need to look back to. Claude Barr was a farmer who lived near the Black Hills of South Dakota and wrote The Jewels of the Plains. And Harlan Hammernick was a fantastic nurseryman who started a nursery in Clarkson, Nebraska called uh, um, Bluebird Nursery. These two have probably done the most to introduce plants from the Great Plains and really make us appreciate our native landscape at the lower elevations. And one of the gardens that has been the Denver Botanic Gardens had a great deal of involvement in was a large formal garden in the heart of downtown Denver called Centennial. And we managed this for many years. Eventually, the city took it over, and it's looking pretty good right now, actually. But this is all full of low water plants, but it's designed with this sort of European model of a very formal garden. But instead of using privet, for example, those are all mountain mahoganies that have been shaped. These are all native shrubs and trees. And this, for example, shows you junipers, a Rocky Mountain juniper, but you can see that it's been planted heavily with tulips. And the same area in another spot is just very thickly planted with tulips. But in the summertime, the tulips are replaced with zinnia. This is the zinnia was growing there the whole time, but when the tulips go dormant, the zinnia comes up. This is our plant select zinnia growing under the same trees that all those bulbs were growing. So the use of these formal native plants was something that was really pioneered at this garden about 20 years ago, and it's persisted with surprisingly little input since then. If you don't have a chance to visit, it's on Little Raven Avenue, very close to Elitch's, just west of Elitch's, a garden well worth visiting for inspiration. But as you can see, between 1990 and 2006, there's been a radical change in the zones that we're definitely getting drier and hotter. And so now it's worth looking back and sort of gauging, because we have a record of almost 200 years. And a lot of people have contributed to our knowledge, but especially the botanists and the horticulturists who have come before us. But I'd like to sort of end by giving a tribute to the fact that Denver, the only city I know of in the world that most of the mountains behind Denver are actually named for botanists. And there's a reason behind this. These are some of the main peaks in the Front Range area, and almost all of these have a botanical association. Gray's Peak and Torrey's Peak were named for the greatest botanists of the 19th century. And Perry was actually the one who named all these things. We'll look at him in a minute. But we do have a peak still named for James. And there's a few others that we'll look at in a minute. And at any rate, this is the man who was to blame for that. He was one of the first professional botanists in North America. He worked for the US government, but he was a doctor by trade, and he practiced in Davenport, Iowa, but he spent his summers on Grizzly Creek, where he had a cabin, which is right at the base of Mount Gray's Peak, which he thought was the highest peak in North America. So he named it Gray's Peak in honor of Asa Gray. And of course, Asa Gray returned the compliment because he named all these plants after him. There's Gentiana perryi and Primula perryi, named for Charles Christopher Perry. And he also was able to eventually get a little credit because this peak was named for him. Perry's Peak is only about 13,400 feet high, but it's there in the botanical peaks, and it should be appropriately, because he was an extremely popular writer. He wrote for the newspaper, and it was syndicated all over the country, and he would tell stories in his articles about the discovery of new plants. And plants were such a big deal in the 19th century. You couldn't be a self-respecting young woman if you didn't have an herbarium. And everybody was interested in the new Latin names. And people like Charles Christopher Perry were actually became household, kind of heroes. They were very well known and respected. And all these mountain peaks, he was able to get the names for them because of his tremendous influence, because botany was a big deal. It was kind of what the most important science back then. And of course, John Torrey was one of his mentors. He honored John Torrey, and he named a peak for him. And of course, there's many plants named for Torrey, like Ephedra torreyana from western Colorado. And John Torrey, his peak is next to Gray's Peak, of course. But it was Gray's Peak that Gray is one of the few botanists who's been on a stamp. This was actually a U.S. stamp, a forever stamp in his name. And of course, he had many names, plants named for him, like our native Angelica Grayi. But because Asa Gray was especially dear and near to Charles Christopher Perry, he gave him the higher of the two peaks, because Asa Gray really was the most influential botanist of the 19th century. So people know about Gray's and Torrey's Peak, but not many people realize these were the two greatest botanists of the 19th century. And of course, they're the two largest peaks directly west of Denver. But there are others as well. This is George Engelmann, and of course, he's most famous for the Engelmann spruce. He was the first botanist, director of Shaw's Garden in Missouri, the Missouri Botanic Gardens. And of course, he named many of the, like this tree, which is found all over the West, was named in his honor. And there's a peak here, Engelmann Peak, at 13,362 feet. Pretty respectable. Not quite as high as the other ones. And a few directors later, William Trelease became director of the Missouri Botanic Gardens, and he has also had plants named for him, like this Puntia basilaris treleasii, and he wrote a book called Winter Botany. Trelease was a highly respected botanist who also earned a peak. This is Mount Trelease at 12,477 feet. But nowadays, who's ever heard of Edward Howard Norton Patterson, whose nickname was Snickdow, but he was actually an extremely influential and popular journalist. He published a paper in Georgetown. He knew everybody, and everybody knew him. He was an extremely well-known guy. In fact, he was a close personal friend. He grew up in Baltimore, and his childhood buddy was Edgar Allan Poe. So Snickdow had quite a history, and he actually discovered this aster, which was named for him, Aster pattersonii. But he didn't have a peak name for him. Name for him is Patterson. He added his nickname. This is Mount Snickdow there. Okay, and by the way, this is his aster has been lumped by some botanists into Macaranthera bigelovii. On the left-hand side, this is the common blue aster you find in low elevations, but our alpine one, which I believe should be recognized as Pattersonii, which is the one named for him, is a very different creature. It's perennial. It's only a few inches high, and I don't think they're the same thing. I don't care, but just be aware. If you look them up in some books, you'll see that they are considered to be the same thing. But there were other very colorful botanists. Probably one of the most colorful botanists who lived in the West was a man named Marcus Jones, and he collected all over the West. Did much of it on a bicycle. But he first started his career in Denver. Well, actually, he was a professor of botany for a while in Colorado College, and also a preacher. So he had a career in teaching, and also in a religion. And he had a religious fervor with the collecting of plants and naming them. And he was very frustrated because they were so slow naming his plants in the East that he started a botanical journal so he could name his plants. And his journal became very popular. It was published and had literally hundreds of new plant names were published. But he started his career in Denver, as did his biggest enemy, Edward Lee Green, was also a minister who was a preacher of Episcopalian church and a religion. I think he eventually became a Catholic, but he started his career in Greeley as a minister. But Colorado inspired him in his botany, and he went on to become one of the first botanists in California. And he lived in the East Bay, and he ended up publishing the Landmarks of Botanical History, and he named literally hundreds, if not thousands, of plants. He and Marcus Jones competed, and they were very frustrated with each other. When Edward Lee Green died, Marcus Jones dedicated a whole issue of his journal saying how happy he was that his competitor died, and many other rather rude remarks. But one of my favorite botanists was Brandegee, and he did much of the botanical exploration in the middle of the 19th century for the railroad surveys, and he concentrated on Colorado for several years. Many plants have been named by and for him, including this beautiful yellow Polemonium brandegii. And he eventually married this lovely woman, and together they published a journal called Zoe. Her name was Catherine Brandegee. It was a second marriage for her, and it was a very happy second marriage. Her first marriage wasn't so hot, and the two of them were so in love that they spent their honeymoon collecting plants between San Diego and San Francisco. They were quite enthusiastic, but she also botanized independently here in Colorado and found quite a few interesting records that have not been found since. So the Brandegees have a special significance for us. Unfortunately, they never got a mountain named after them. And the person who really deserved a mountain would be this woman. This is Alice Eastwood, and she was born in Toronto, but she grew up in Denver, spent most of her life in her childhood in Denver, graduated from East High School, where she taught subsequently, but every time she had a chance, she would go botanizing in the mountains, and she even found a mimulus that was named for her in Utah, and I was very glad to find this, to be the first to find it in Colorado. But she became the premier botanist at the California Academy of Sciences and is credited for saving California from complete of confusion botanically, because she saved all the type specimens in the California Academy of Sciences when the building was damaged by the earthquake and ultimately burned. She took them away in time and protected them until they could eventually be preserved. So she is a real heroine of California botany. She lived until the 1950s, and late in her life, an entire botanical international congress was held to honor her and her work. And she attended it in her early 90s. So she had a difficult childhood. She'd had to work as a nanny for wealthy families, and she worked as a seamstress and ultimately as a teacher. But she finally was able to go to California, where she became one of the first botanists in the state there, and had a glorious career. But the man I really think we should honor the most is the first botanist who ever came to Colorado, and that was Edwin James. And he was on that first expedition 200 years ago. And most of his narrative about that expedition was about the Native Americans, whom he had an enormous interest and respect for. And ultimately, he became a champion and learned Chippewa, or Ojibwe, the language of the Chippewa, and translated the Bible into it, and worked with the Native peoples in the upper Midwest. And he helped a man named John Tanner write his story. He had been captured as a child by the Chippewa, grew up with them, but because he was blue-eyed and blonde, they didn't trust him eventually. So he came back, and Edwin James helped him and eventually took his story down, which is considered a classic of American anthropology, published in the middle of the 19th century. But in his book, he would, in the book that he wrote about his expedition, he said things that were so far ahead of his time. He said, it would be highly desirable that some law for the preservation of game might be extended to and rigidly enforced in the country where the bison is still met with. He saw the destruction of the bison herds, and he was horrified. So he really was a conservationist before conservation came about. And his copious notes about the native peoples are some of the only records we have about many of their experiences back then. They took many drawings were done of them, and they took long vocabulary lists from all the different tribes they met. And they described one tribe in particular, the Ozarks, and they were concerned because there were so few and they were so sickly that they named a mountain range after them, the Ozark Mountains. They were the first to come to the Ozarks, and they said, this tribe may not be around in the future and their memory should be preserved. So that expedition is responsible for the name of the Ozark Mountains. And they brought back, this is one of their trophies. They purchased this from the Indians, showing even then they were using some guns and battling with each other. In 1830, he wrote, "The project of congregating the Indians not only west of the Mississippi, but in the burning deserts which skirt the eastern base of the Rocky Mountains is more pregnant with injustice and cruelty than anything else." He was writing, of course, about Andrew Jackson's policy of taking the Cherokees from the southeast and bringing them to Oklahoma. And he was almost half the tribe was killed on that Trail of Tears. And Edwin James was extremely active in trying to promote awareness of the injustice done to the Native Americans. And there's the expedition on the left-hand side. You can see the participants are meeting with some of the tribes along the way in the eastern woodlands. They met wherever they went with the Indians, and they were able to communicate with them using sign language. They did a lot of work with sign language and also some interpreters. So their records in this book are very valuable. If you can get an original edition, when I was a kid, they were selling it for about $500 on Broadway, where all the bookstores were back then. I'm kicking myself I didn't buy one, because nowadays, if you want to buy it, it's more like $22,000. But I've settled for a recent reprint, and I would like to say that reading it has been very inspiring to me. And reading about Edwin James, this is a letter he wrote to Charles Christopher Perry. He says, "I became a settler in Iowa 22 years ago, and I've seen great changes. The locomotive engine and the railroad car scour the plains in place of the wolf and the curlew. Mayweed and dog fennel, stinkweed and mullein have taken the place of the purple phlox and the moccasin flower. The Celt, the Dane, the Swede, and the Dutchman are here instead of the Black Hawk, Wabasha, Waboos, Maniozet, and their bands." He was truly a romantic and had a great regard. And I think it's a kind of a tragedy that his peak that he has been given is that much lower than Pike, because I think he was a much greater man. He was a medical doctor, an environmentalist before his time, an abolitionist. His farm was a major part of the Underground Railroad. He was a linguist and an anthropologist, a champion of the Native American people's rights, an author, a farmer, and best of all, he was a scientist and an explorer. So I'd like to all of us kind of give some respect for this remarkable man and this extraordinary expedition. I think it's incredible that the first scientific expedition to Colorado included such incredibly remarkable people as Edwin James. And that's it.
That's fantastic.